Okay. So good evening, everyone. We welcome you all to this 13th episode of Late Night Retina. And in this episode, our theme is X-Files or Masquerades. Okay. So we have a very talented group of panelists today. We have Dr. Apurva. She's a consultant for Vetro Retina at MM Joshi Eye Hospital, Hubli. Dr. Divyansh Mishra. He's a consultant at Shankar Eye Foundation, Bangalore. And Dr. Mohit Dogra, who is an assistant professor at PGI Chandigarh. We have two presenters. The first will be Dr. Abhishek Gupta. He's a senior resident from AIMS Patna. And we have Dr. Anirban Chakrabarti, who is a medical officer in Arvind Eye Hospital, Madurai. So I'm your host, Bhavik Panchal, and we'll start the meeting as soon as possible. Yeah, I think we're ready to start now. Yes. So all over to you, Abhishek. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I would like to thank UC for giving me this opportunity. I will just share my screen. So, are my slides visible?
Yes, Abhishek, you are loud and clear, and we can see your slides. You can go to the slides. Yeah, thank you.
So, the case I am going to present today is of a dreaded drusenoid. So, I will begin with the case presentation. So, a 51-year-old male presented to the IOPD with complaints of floaters in left eye for 20 days. He had no other complaints. He was neither diabetic nor hypertensive, and he didn't have any other systemic complaints. So on ocular examination, vision in right eye was 6/6 and in left eye was 6/9. IOP was normal. Anterior segment examination, both eye was unremarkable. Right eye fundus was normal. Left eye had mild vitritis and some cell clumps in the anterior vitreous phase. So we ordered a basic uveitic profile consisting of CBC, ESR, RBS, Mantoux, VDRL, and chest X-ray. All these tests turned out to be normal. So provisionally, we diagnosed him as a case of left eye intermediate uveitis and started him on tablet Viceron 50 mg to be tapered by 10 milligram every week. And we told him to review with us after 1 month. He came back to us after 1 month, but this time he told that his vision in left eye had dropped by 1 line. It was 6/12. He was complaining of floaters in both eyes. Anterior segment was unremarkable. Coming to fundus evaluation, right eye we can see multiple, here in the right eye fundus revealed multiple speck-like lesions deposited over the retina. It was something like drusen-like deposits, which was better appreciated on red-free photograph. We did the peripheral evaluation also. No snowbank or peripheral snow banking was seen. Left eye also, it had mild vitritis, and you can see here punctate lesions deposited over the retina over the posterior pole. Better appreciated on
performed in all cases of macular hole to look at the health of the
sorry, Abhishek, just a moment. We request all the participants to mute their mics.
Counsel the patient regarding.
Yeah, and even the host can just mute everyone except for the presenter. Yes, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Yeah, Abhishek, you need to unmute yourself and then you can speak.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So left eye too had similar drusen-like deposits, minute drusen-like deposits. You can see here on the posterior pole. Periphery was normal. There was neither snow banking or any snowballs. So we did an autofluorescence. It was essentially normal in both eyes. On OCT, in right eye, hyperreflective spots were seen in the outer retina at all levels. You can appreciate these hyperreflective spots just above the RPE in the photoreceptor zone. Over here, over here. Left eye too had similar deposits, hyperreflective deposits over the RPE in the outer retina. Over here, over here. So we did an FFA and ICG. This is the early phase FFA and ICG of right eye. Early phase FFA showed mild hyperfluorescence over the posterior pole, and correspondingly hypocyanosin spots were seen on ICG. In the mid to late phase, these hypocyanosin spots on ICG increased, and now it was well seen over the posterior pole, scattered throughout the posterior pole. FFA, correspondingly, FFA showed little increase of hyperfluorescence in the posterior pole. Just to show the magnified image of the ICG, multiple punctate hypocyanescent spots scattered throughout the posterior pole with surrounding hypercyanescence was seen. It was a typical something like moth appearance or leopard skin mottling type of appearance. So similar findings were noted in the left eye too. You can see here minute hypocyanescent spots. FFA was unremarkable. And these spots increased in the mid to or late phase. Ultrasound was done to evaluate the retinochoroidal thickness. It was essentially normal. So the salient features of our case was that it had vitritis with multifocal drusen-like deposits over the posterior pole, ICG multifocal hypocyanescent lesions surrounded by hypercyanescence. FFA showed minimal hyperfluorescence. All the basic uveitic profile was within normal limits, and patient was not responding to steroids. So at this time we revised our differentials, and we thought either it could be an intermediate uveitis or multifocal choroiditis. It could be an ocular TB, sarcoid, syphilis, birdshot chorioretinopathy, and very remote chances of choroidal mets or masquerade. So accordingly, we did further lab evaluation. We ordered complete blood count, peripheral blood smear, serum ACE, lysozyme, BDRL, FT-ABS, LFT, RFT, routine examination, urine, and ultrasound whole abdomen. All this turned out to be normal. So at this stage, what we were left was with this, only with clinical and the supportive multimodal imaging. So still we didn't have any clue. So just we might be missing something in the CNS. So we ordered an MRI brain, and it revealed a occipital lobe lesion of dimension 1.7 centimeter. You could well see over here and over here, which was hypointense on T1 and hyperintense on T2, and it showed partial enhancement with contrast. So at this stage now we thought that there is something more sinister apart from the eye. So we referred him to a neurosurgeon. The neurosurgeon evaluated him, and then he took him for excision biopsy of that mass lesion. He did the excision biopsy and sent it for histopathological examination. So the patient came back to us with the histopathological examination report. So, and it showed this. So the histopathology slides, they showed cells consisting of prominent nucleoli with scant cytoplasm, and on immunohistochemistry, it was CD20 positive and BCL2 positive. And the pathologists have made a diagnosis of a high-grade malignant B-cell lymphoma. Our patient had a primary CNS lymphoma with ocular involvement. So at this stage, we referred him to the oncology department in the JIPMER Pondicherry, where he was thoroughly evaluated systemically. PET CT was ordered to look for any extra CNS spread. There was no extra CNS spread. And then he was put on 5 cycles of chemotherapy consisting of rituximab, procarbazine, vincristine, and methotrexate. So this went on for 4 to 5 months, and then he came back to us after 4 months. So, but he still had floaters in left eye. But good thing was that his condition had not worsened in that eye. It was static. His anterior segment was unremarkable. So this was the pre-chemo state. And when he came back to us after 4 months, so this is the post-chemo. So you can see all those small drusen-like deposits which was there over the posterior pole, they had disappeared. And that hyperreflective spots at the outer retina, it also had vanished. This is the right eye. This is the left eye pre-chemo OCT and fundus pic. And this is the left eye and post-chemo left eye. Same appearance, that all those spots, these deposits, they had disappeared, and there was nothing in the outer retina. But an ERM was evident here in left eye. So this is better appreciated on Redfi photograph. This is the pre-chemo. This is the post-chemo pic. This is the left eye, pre-chemo and post-chemo. That lesion on the MRI also had resolved. This was the earlier lesion, and this is post-excision biopsy and chemo, which was reduced to a gliotic scar. So actually, in retrospect, when I thought about how this patient has presented to us, so he presented with this fundus pic, which could be easily missed. His vision also was only 6/9, 6/12. So probably he might have been just classified as something as intermediate ARMD and just we continued with a multivitamin. But actually, he had an underlying occipital B cell lymphoma. So at this stage, I will just end my case over here, and I will ask the eminent panelists about their experience of similar cases, and how would they have worked up a case like this, and is there any role of intravitreal chemotherapy?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abhishek. Yeah, so we'll address all the queries. Thank you for sharing the presentation with us. A very lucid presentation and quite an interesting case. So coming to the first question. So my question is to Dr. Apurva actually. So Dr. Apurva, when we look at the fundus, we know that these are not drusen. Okay, we can make it out sometimes looking at it that they are mimickers of ARMD, dry ARMD. So now, and when we go into further investigations, like in this case, an ICG or an angiogram, we see that pattern of leopard spots. So my question to you is that what are the differentials of leopard spots in the angiogram or the fundus picture, and how do we differentiate them from drusen?
Unmute yourself. Apurva, unmute yourself.
Yeah, all the participants, whenever they speak, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry. Yes. Can you hear me without the echo now? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. It's all clear, Dr. Apurva.
Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Madan, can you reduce the volume on that fully? Yeah. So leopard mottling is actually a finding that we see whenever we have a spontaneously reattached retina. So it could be a feature of exudative RD that has spontaneously reattached. It could be a feature of RP proliferation that has happened. So the basic pathology or the basic finding, histological finding in leopard mottling is that there are focal areas of RP clumping, and the adjacent area next to it would be RP atrophy, which is why you get alternating patches of hypo and hyper. Please give me 1 second. So when we look at the OCT finding in leopard mottling, this is what is happening. So whenever there is a long-standing RD, there is a long-standing loss of contact between the neurosensory retina and the RP. There will be some amount of outer retinal loss along with the RP because of the spontaneous reattachment, which is why there are alternating patches of hypo and hyper. So leopard mottling is traditionally a finding that we see clinically or on autofluorescence. So we have various conditions where you can have this sort of mottling. It could be because there was a CSC which was long standing and it reattached, the SRF disappeared. So that can show leopard mottling, chronic CSC or a bullous CSC that was there and now has reattached. Exudative RD due to any other cause like a nanophthalmos, uveal effusion syndrome, or a exudative RD due to any other cause which has come and gone, like a CSC or a ciliocoroidal effusion. So there you will have leopard mottling. One more interesting condition is, of course, where there is areas of RP proliferation, something like a uveal melanocytic proliferation, which is sometimes bilateral or even sometimes unilateral. A B dump, that is, there also you can have a leopard mottling. Like I said before, leopard mottling is a clinical or an AF finding. Interestingly, Abhishek, in your case, we are not seeing it really on the AF and the FFA, which is very, very interesting. We are seeing it on the ICG, which suggests that there is something going on in the choroid. The AF does not pick up anything that is on the choroid. So uh, it's very interesting that there is probably some amount of choroidal melanocytic proliferation that is happening, which is why it is showing up only on the ICGA and not on the FFA and autofluorescence, which are short wavelength imaging methods. So I hope I told some differentials about leopard mottling, and I would also like Divyansh's and Mohit's opinion on this interesting finding in this case,
Yeah, actually,
where
yes.
you see this mottled appearance on the ICGA and not the classical AF for the FFA, what we
Yeah.
see.
Yeah,
Thank you,
So I'm
Apurva.
not sure if you can really call this leopard mottling.
True.
It is not.
something like a moth-eaten appearance. It was.
It's very interesting, Abhishek. So I
Yeah.
would like your opinion also on this.
So any comments here, Dr. Divyansh or Dr. Mohit, on per se the discussion of leopard spots, which Dr. Apurva has explained so beautifully?
No, I think she's kind of included most things. Just wanted to say two things. Anytime, at any point in time, I think if you can either clinically or on any imaging, if you think you've been able to diagnose or label the patient to have leopard skin, parents, there is no good diagnosis that goes with that. I mean, the best case, a patient might just get away with a hypertensive choroidopathy, which could also have, or like a fairly, if I can call it, benign uveal effusion. But there is no good news, or there very, very seldom is good news associated with leopard skin appearance. So once you get that, I think your antennas need to be up, and then you need to work around with whatever else you have in the eye and try and look at those 5, 6, 7, 8 differentials that Apurva rightly pointed out. But it's basically a red flag that needs to alert everybody.
True. Yes, Dr. Mohit. So, staying on red flags, basically, whenever we see this leopard mottling, so one of the important red flags is primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, as elucidated by Dr. Abhishek in this case. So, my next question to you is that, so when do you suspect primary vitreoretinal lymphoma just on clinical examination or investigations, or what are the further steps you will be performing once you have this a kind of a picture that, okay, this is one of my differential, what will you do next now?
So,
Sorry.
Divyansh takes it.
Yeah, Dr. Divyansh.
Bhavik, the question is for me, is it?
No, I was asking Dr. Mohit actually about the clinical.
Okay, yeah, okay. Sorry, my bad. So I'll just be sharing a small PPT. Well, it's a little larger than small, but I promise to go through it quickly. And it's basically going to be clinical cases of where, starting from the, if I can call the routine, there's nothing routine about a primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, but from the textbook picture where you should kind of see the patient and kind of know that a vitreoretinal lymphoma is your first DD, and we'll end up with something which will actually completely take you off guard, and we'll say, kuch bhi ho sakta hai. So we're just going to go through that, and maybe that should answer some of the questions as to when to clinically suspect based on just the fundus photo history, clinical examination, autofluorescence, and fluorescein angiography with or without OCT. So that's basically.
Yeah, you can share your screen, Dr. Mohit.
Is the screen visible?
Yes, you are visible, and
Yes.
the screen is visible too.
Thank you. So we're just going to get straight into it then. So I have 5 different cases, and quickly we'll go through them, and they have different kind of, I won't say a spectrum, but just a couple of lines before we go into this. So primary vitreoretinal lymphoma is kind of self-explanatory to a little bit. It includes the term vitreo and retinal. So it can involve just the vitreous without any involvement of the retina. It can involve just the retina with minimal or no involvement of the vitreous. It could involve both concurrently, or it could involve one and the other subsequently. We are not talking about secondary vitreoretinal lymphomas. We're not talking about choroidal lymphomas, and we're not talking about lymphomas other than the PC, the primary CNS, the primary vitreoretinal, which might be concurrent or primary second. So basically talking just about that subset and its presentations, which is the commonest masquerade in the elderly. So again, this is a 56-year-old female. She presented with gradual painless decrease in vision, both eyes, right since 8 months, left since 3 months. That's the right eye, right? And you can see what's going on. There was some vitreous cells, some haze is there. You can't make out the inferior disc margin. There's a yellow clump, if I can say, And that's the left eye. I hope you can see it clearly. That's the autofluorescence. That's exactly the kind of finding that Apurva was alluding to. You see that in a lady that, that age with vitreous cells or without vitreous cells, that conglomerate of findings, and that OCT. This is the OCT of the right eye, right? And if you were to look at this, so these are your typical. You have your typical DLS, hyperreflective, isoreflective maybe, and you have those, drusens, those iso to hyperreflective, elevations of the RPE. And say presence or absence of cystoid macular edema neither goes in favor nor against PVRL. It was earlier believed that once you get cystoid macular edema, it's unlikely to be PVRL. That is no longer true. So that's the right eye. That's the left eye. The left eye had no cells, mind you. You can also not see or make out any cells on the posterior vitreous in the OCT line scan. No intraretinal fluid, but you can see those, corresponding to what you can see clinically, that RP mottling. Now this is a text. Now, if in this patient a lymphoma, primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, is not your first differential, then you're missing the boat, because both eyes have a varied presentation. You have the OCT, you have those leopard skin appearance in the left eye. We haven't done an angiogram, vitreous cells in the right eye, and you also have these, typical sub RPE deposits which are there. With that, we'll come to the second patient. Now, this is a little bit older, a little bit of an older gentleman, 62 male, at bilateral, gradual painless diminution of vision for 3 months, diabetic, coronary artery disease, status post cardiac stenting, 1/60, no AC cells, vitritis. That's what he had. So most people would just look at that and pass it off as, he has coronary stenting, he has that. He could just have multiple branch retinal vein occlusions. It looks like it. The disc is pale as well. That's the left eye. Right? Again, counting finger 1 feet, AC is quiet, had 1+ vitreous cells, had that, people might label it to be acute retinal necrosis and necrotizing retinitis. It could be PON if people look at it. But these lesions are elevated. They are 3-dimensional. They have volume. And if you were to look closely at this, you can actually see that kind of leopard mottling on it, what you could not see because of those smaller clumps in the first case. And just to, ensure that you've done what you want to do, that's your exuberant kind of, leopard skin appearance in both the eyes. And there, I mean, you won't see a better leopard skin than that in that eye. Now, that is a clinical. Now this is a clinical, FFA based diagnosis. This is a lymphoma unless proven otherwise. You offer this patient staging and diagnostic surgery at the outset, of course, with MRIs and clearances and everything. But this is, now you can't miss this. This is a lymphoma and nothing else. And this is what you see if you do the OCT through those lesions. Typical, similar to the ones in the last patient, but a little more advanced. Sub-RPE deposits, which are generally iso-reflective, will never be hyper. And, they tend to get better with methotrexate. We're not getting into the management. This is now we'll just depart a little bit. So we saw what the normal routine, fairly garden variety PVRL should look like, where the index of suspicion should be high clinically, should not be missed. This is a 46 lady, younger. She's not even 50.
So, Dr. Mohit, I'll just pause you here so that my idea is that we can finish up with a typical case.
Sure.
And I'll come back to you. You keep your PPT on here itself. Do not unshare it.
Yeah.
Okay. So since you went about the management part, before that, in between, there's an important step of investigation and also doing a vitreous sample. So I'd like to bring in Dr. Divyansh here at this point in time, that once what Dr. Mohit explained based on angiogram and OCT. So it is, you are sure that, okay, this is a diagnosis, but then you need to clinically prove it before injecting methotrexate or going ahead with the chemotherapy for this patient. So what investigations you need to perform at presentation in a case of suspected primary vitreal lymphoma, Dr. Divyansh?
Yeah, thank you, Bhavik. Yeah, so PVRL is an interesting disease. So what happens is that if we have a doubt, something which is called as trial of intravitreal methotrexate can also be given if you have doubt. So, but if you have cases which have clear-cut clinical and clinico-radiological means, your investigative modalities are supporting your diagnosis, In that cases, yes, so you can directly start with your treatment with methotrexate, or what is called as methotrexate challenge or an intravitreal challenge. So once you give and then you see the response as Dr. Mohit is showing, for the first injection itself, you would start seeing that all the deposits would start to decrease, and then the smaller deposits would take time, but the larger chunks would decrease, and then they would become consolidated. Other most important part, something what Dr. Mohit was alluding to, is something which is called as diagnostic vitrectomy. If you are in doubt even after your investigations, your FA, your OCT, and you have very high suspicion. So in PVRL, it's Dr. Mohit would also second that thought, that it's a suspicion that you are suspecting PVRL in such cases, because it would otherwise look very ominous, and then the diagnosis comes with either your clinically very high suspicion or your diagnostic accuracy. So diagnostic accuracies, you come with vitrectomies, and vitrectomy, when you're performing, the best thing is to use as minimal cut rate as possible. Try to go to 600, 500, or sometimes even 400, so that when you're cutting into the vitreous, you're not damaging the lymphoma cells, because those are very, very fragile cells. And in cases where you do not have such large chunk in the vitreous cavity, in those cases, we have to do something which is called as a retinal biopsy, or in very rare circumstances, if you think that it's a choroidal type, then a choroidal biopsy, where in a retinal biopsy, you make a cauterize a hole and then try to aspirate the chunk of the largest area where you feel those kind of deposits are. Either you can use a flute needle and attach infusion tubing and a 5cc syringe and then actively suck it, or you can use your cutter and then pass on the whole material which is coming to the cassette and then on to the investigation. So in a primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, this is the first step towards a diagnosis, where you are just giving the sample, but managing the sample from your site of taking the sample to reaching it to a pathologist to make it stain and do things is very important. So as early as possible, the person has to be ready for the transport. There are different medias which can be used. You can send it in BSS if it can be transported within an hour or so. If you are expecting that it's taking more than that, then other specific medias, you can call your pathologist and ask them that what would be preferable, because if you have a lab which is in-house, like what Dr. Mohit has, yes, probably a BSS sample itself would help, because it would be within an hour, they would process the sample. But if it would be taking a longer, more than 1 hour, then there are different types like formalin or Hope solution, Cytolite or RMPI. So these are different solutions which are available, which we need to have it available when you are planning for this kind of biopsies. And once the biopsy is done, or whatever material you have taken, it has to be sent at the earliest for the confirmation. Yeah, back to Bhavik, or Mohit can also add on to this.
Yes. So that was very insightful. So coming to Dr. Mohit, so coming to a case like what you mentioned about intravitreal methotrexate. So sticking on to that point, the next question would be is what are your indications for local treatment or intravitreal chemotherapy? When do you practice it?
Yeah, so if you're looking at the PVRL, subset in which there is, you have proven after either a neurological evaluation or just neurological imaging, which has to be MRI and not CT scan, that there is no CNS disease. So we're looking at primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, which is A, either uniocular, just uniocular involvement, B, binocular, and C, we're looking at CNS disease, either concurrent with intraocular involvement, or which happened during local treatment for intraocular disease. So we're going to begin with one. So if there is no CNS disease and there is just unilateral involvement, then so whether you want to give systemic chemotherapy or not, most of the times your hemato-oncologist will just sit on it and not push the patient for systemic chemotherapy. You will generally be on your own, and you will be asked to treat the ocular disease with your with your local intravitreal chemotherapy. Since the past 3 years, my intravitreal chemotherapy of choice is intravitreal rituximab for multiple reasons. Yes, it's more expensive, but we can actually pool these patients. We sometimes have 2 or 3 patients not every month. I'm not saying we have 2-3 patients every month, but once, I don't know, it's maybe cyclical, so we can actually have those patients coming in. The frequency of injection with rituximab is much lower, so we tend to give it. I tend to give it every fortnight. And also the toxicity, the surface toxicity, which after methotrexate is just killing. And after the second to third injection, although the patient's lesions get a lot better, the patient gets miserable, can't open his eyes, gets bad ocular surface disease. And even if you supplement with oral folic acid, it gets mitigated a bit. But methotrexate has major issues. You can have a few tricks in which you might want to do a AC tap prior to injecting methotrexate to decrease the volume of the eye, and also to prevent any kind of reflux when you're injecting. But again, even minimal microliter reflux of methotrexate during intravitreal injection is going to be not great. And this is a compounded toxicity. So third, fourth injection onwards, patients don't like you anymore. Rituximab does not have any of that. Lesser number of injections, longer dosing frequencies. So that's my thing. If the patient has binocular involvement at presentation and no CNS disease, the patient should be on systemic chemotherapy. And starting systemic chemotherapy takes time. The patient might be diabetic, hypertensive, neutropenic, have other issues, elderly. These patients might have other comorbidities. Chemotherapy is not a joke. So till that time, you have to manage the ocular disease. So it's always good to start injecting once you're okay with your diagnosis ocularly. And then bilateral disease with or without CNS involvement, you need systemic chemotherapy till the hemato-oncologist can actually start them on chemotherapy. And mind you, it'll be about after the third cycle of chemotherapy that you'll be starting to see ocular advantages. And the hemato-oncologist is going to he has the only window that he has to monitor the CNS disease short of an MRI is our picture. So again, we need to take care of that also. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mohit, for the detailed answer there. My next question actually is a very practical question to Dr. Divyansh. As we know, even in this case, the differential what Abhishek presented can range from tuberculosis, sarcoidosis. So many times even we see in our clinic, the patients who are referred are already on oral steroids. Okay, so now in case you have to take a biopsy sample or you have to make a decision, how do you deal this with this dilemma or with this situation?
So yeah, that's the same question which I wanted to ask Dr. Abhishek also, because what happens is the steroid itself can have a waxing and waning kind of a presentation in cases of even PVRL. Very high dose steroids can decrease this kind of infiltrates, and as the steroid is tapered, it's again come and then increase. So in his case, I think the steroids are on and still the vitreous cells have not decreased as much. So it's very difficult to find such cases, but yes, we have seen cases where we see this waxing and waning. The most important thing that if we are planning a biopsy in such case, ideally is to stop at least 3 weeks before, so that the effect of the steroid is taken care of, and then you plan for doing this biopsy. One more thing which I just wanted to add Mohit's discussion is there are certain reports of combination of treatment of rituximab plus methotrexate, but all those would be very advanced cases where they are not responsive to one and not responsive to other. And as Dr. Mohit is telling that most important when you're injecting methotrexate, you have to be careful because surface side effects are really affecting the patients. As Mohit is telling, once you start treating it, by the third injection, they would tell, I do not want this injection because it would be really like the sand going into the eye. It's very painful for such patients. So that's it, Bhavik. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So coming back to Dr. Mohit about, can you just explain the varied presentations, the presentation what you have made, and with the varied ocular presentations of primary vitreoretinal lymphoma in maybe next 2 or 3 minutes?
Absolutely. Quickly. I'm sorry I've taken more time, so I'll just
no problem. Yeah.
Yes. So so again, so we were at this lady. So she's 46, younger, less than 50, was being treated as a case of acute retinal necrosis, left eye, for the past 2.5 months with no improvement. Now, if just the history should get your antennas up. No iron is going to last 2.5 months without either destroying the retina, causing a retinal detachment, or getting better. Iron doesn't sit on it. It's acute for a reason. So that's what the patient had. The posterior pole's not that bad, has some vitreous cells, had KPs, whatever that is. That is nasal. That looks like a retinitis. That looks like full thickness necrotizing retinitis. That's a blown up picture. Hemorrhages as well. You could say it's CMV. That's the OCT through it. The OCT is not what you'd expect such a necrotizing lesion to have. Now, okay, 10 days later, that's what we see. That's what we had initially, nothing there. 10 days later, she got that dull yellow kind of a posterior subretinal hypopyon, which you can see right there. That's actually passing through it. That is that hypopyon passing, right there. And she also had those, those early sub RPE deposits which weren't there earlier. 17 days later, lo and behold, she has the full blown kind of, those yellow subretinal deposit, and you can actually see that line passing through it. That that's what she has. Again, what happened to her, what I did, I'm not going to look at, but atypical non-responding necrotizing retinitis, irrespective of age, if you're in that, this is 46, please consider primary vitreoretinal lymphoma. Just the second last thing. So again, 62-year-old male, diminution of vision. We just talked about oral steroids and how they affect someone diagnosed as multifocal choroiditis involving the macula, was treating with oral steroids, was hand motions vision, had RAPD 2+ cells flare, really poor vision, and that's what he had in the right eye. Now, I think all of us would know that so I'll just come to that. It could be a lot of things. It's not choroiditis. It's bulky, it's elevated. You could see that RPE modeling clinically, that, and there are hemorrhages. And you can also see that in temporal to the fovea in the left eye. So this is, again, not a diagnostic dilemma. This has to be a lymphoma, and you have to work towards it as the clinical diagnosis unless proven otherwise. And again, huge mounds, and these are your typical drusenoid deposits that you'd get passing through those small things. And of course, with that amount of deposits, you'd actually get those. Last case, again, so a 22-year-old girl. 22-year-olds have no reason, have no right to be in a PVRL presentation. Unfortunately, this lady is. Kashmiri lady presented with left eye vision loss for the past 2 months, no light perception. That's what she had. She has a tractional retinal detachment. You can see that. And she had subretinal fibrosis. That was what the right eye was, 6/6. That's fine. So we said, chalo, we'll see why she got it. We'll talk about it. Never came back. Presented to us 2.5 years later. Acuity 6/9, vitreous cells 1+ in the right eye. You can see the picture very similar to what Dr. Abhishek showed. If I can use his, his terminology, the dangerous drusenoid, which this is not. You can see that on the IR. You can see that on the blown up that. So where was she in those 2.5 years? Well, about a month after coming to us, she actually had intractable seizures, dizziness, was found to have a mass lesion in the parietal lobe, underwent treatment in Delhi. They had a biopsy proven diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which was treated with systemic chemotherapy. So a 22-year-old lady presenting like that. I don't know what to tell you with that, but that's just, one of the really weird presentations. You miss something like that, that is understandable. I don't think anyone's going to jump at lymphoma in this. But the ones I talked about earlier, also non-resolving retinitis is something we need to look at. Just one last slide regarding, the lesions that Dr. Abhishek showed. I think this paper is typical of what, those lesions, you need not have sub-RPE drusens, detachments. You can have isolated retinal, subretinal involvement, typical as Dr. Jampol has coined the term vertical hyperreflective lines. And actually in his paper, you can go through it. It's in JAMA 2018. It said that these are precursors to those sub-RPE deposits. And actually when these go, clinically, there is nothing. Fluorescein, there is nothing. IR, there is nothing. Autofluorescence, there is nothing. But OCT, you can pick them up. Similar to what Abhishek had. And I'm pretty sure had they done ICG, which they haven't, they would have had the appearance that you had. So these are typical. And if you treat them, they go away. If you don't treat them, they're in the areas where those lesions were, are the areas exactly where you get those sub-RPE drusenoid deposits. So this is an early marker, which you might see in the absence of clinically detectable lesions, or you also might see in very clinically subtle lesions, similar to ones that Dr. Abhishek has, without those typical sub-RPE deposits. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mohit. So we have understood the differential diagnosis of the leopard spots. We understood how to investigate these patients, how to treat them. Now, the story doesn't end here. So I want to bring in Dr. Divyansh again and ask him that, so you identified the patient early and you treated the patient, but what about the prognosis of such individuals? Okay, whether you treat them, you don't treat them, whether they have presence of CNS lymphoma or no CNS lymphoma. Any insight into that, Dr. Divyansh?
Yeah, so I would like to answer in two ways. One, how to identify if there is a recurrence. So one, we would be identifying clinically that there are new lesions, as Dr. Mohit has showed that a young girl is showing new lesions which were not there 2 years before, and then they start appearing at new areas and new small lesions. There is something which I was reading up in this is that aqueous tap or AC tap can be done, and IL-10 is one of the markers which is been shown or proven to identify early recurrences or relapses. And to talk about, yes, the survival, the 5-year survival. So there is one more treatment modality, something which is called as a whole brain radiation. So that is also one more treatment modality which can be opted for. But yes, the complications are very high, like radiation retinopathy, loss of vision because of cataract, and radiation-induced other complications. But the survival rate has found out that the systemic chemotherapy is as good as the radiation. So that's why we were not discussing all this. So what is the survival rate? So it depends on what type of this large B-cell lymphoma is. So there are two types. One is germinal cell, germinal center type, and other one is activated B cell. So if it's an activated B cell, the chances of survival is 30%. That is very low. It's 5 years. And if it is a germinal center one, it's 70%. So yes, the story doesn't end when you are treating the patient. It's the future, and future is not very bright in lymphoma. So we need to discuss this with the patient pre-hand itself. And we have lost patients when we were injecting methotrexate also. So yes, sad story is also there of this.
Yes, absolutely true. So I thank Dr. Abhishek for bringing us a wonderful case, and we could have a good discussion on that. Before Dr. Anirban, our second host for the day, shares his screen, I'll just sum up the few learning points from this case. What Apurva mentioned about the differential diagnosis of leopard spots. Basically, you can see in conditions where there's long-standing retinal detachment or an exudative retinal detachment, be it because of B dump or even chronic long-standing CSCR, even uveal effusion syndrome. Basically, there are RP mottling and RP clumping which happens, and that is what you see. The diagnostic characteristic is in the OCT, what you see the sub-RP deposits and the leopard spots clinically or on autofluorescence. PVRL, what Dr. Mohit explained us, can involve not only the vitreous but the retina or both. And important thing about doing the vitreous biopsy is that minimal cut rate is required, as low as maybe 300 to 500. So important that the cells are not destroyed. Retinal biopsy can also be taken. Sample management is equally important. Dr. Divyansh mentioned about the different media which are available, and when to use local therapy, either it's methotrexate or rituximab. And other important point is presence of IL-10 as a marker for recurrence. So these are the learning points which I felt that is important from this case. So moving on to the next case, thank you all, and thank you Abhishek as well. We go on to Dr. Anirban. Dr. Anirban, if you can share your screen.
So Bhavik, just to add, so there is one more type of PVRL. So as we know, one is choroidal, one is vitreoretinal. There is one more which is called as iridial, where we may have only anterior chamber inflammation or cells. In those cases, yes, AC tap and looking for IL-10, or either if the cells are there, again, we can send it for biopsies. That is one. There is some kind of a specific sign which has been associated with the KPs, which has this kind of anterior uveitis in cases of this iridial lymphoma, something they have mentioned as dendritic and branching type. So there was one paper published from NN Group also regarding this. I just forgot about that.
Okay, so some food for thought for all the participants. So moving ahead, so we have Dr. Anirban Chakravarti. He is a medical officer from Arvind Eye Hospitals, Madurai. So Dr. Anirban, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you're loud and clear. Please go ahead. Your slides are visible as well.
Okay. So I want to thank Yossi to give me this opportunity to present a case here at this platform. My case is of creamy retinal vessels. So a 58-year-old female presented with diminution of vision in both eyes for the last 10 days. She had no history of diabetes, hypertension, or any cardiac disease. Her systemic examination was within normal limits. BP, pulse were normal. On ocular examination, we found out that best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was 6/36 and left eye was 5/60. Anterior segment findings were within normal limit with no NVI in both the eyes. Then when we took a fundus picture, we found out that there were creamy retinal vessels in both the eyes, along with drusen-like deposits and geographic atrophy kind of a picture at the fovea in both eyes, along with neovascularization of disc in both eyes. So when we did the OCT, we found out there was drusen-like deposits in both the eyes, along with gross degeneration of outer retinal layers. And then when we passed the scan line through the retinal vessels, we could see the backshadowing in both the eyes. Then when we did an octa picture, we found out there was neovascularization of disc in both the eyes. So from this we came to a diagnosis. We thought of the differential diagnosis, which were, one is creamy lipemia retinalis. Another one could be like calcification of retinal vessels due to long-standing PDR or retinal vein occlusions, or it can be due to retinal crystals, which mostly are oxalosis. So then when we further interrogated her and we looked into her past history, we found out that she had recurrent urinary tract infections since 2012. She was diagnosed with Staghorn calculi in both the kidneys in 2013. She underwent right-sided percutaneous nephrolithotomy and degenerating twice. And after that, she was on Ayurvedic treatment for the last 4 years. So we ordered blood investigations where we saw that urea was very highly elevated. Creatinine was also very high. Phosphorus was very high, and intact parathermal levels were very high. However, lipid profile was within normal limits, which ruled out lipemia retinalis, and blood sugar was also normal. So then we sent her, because the uric creatinine was very high, we sent her to a nephrologist who ordered urine examination. And the urine examination showed there was abundant amount of phosphate crystals in the urine. And then we ordered for cardiovascular evaluation, where echo and carotid Doppler were within normal limits. So then we asked for a previous blood investigations, where we found out that creatinine level was elevated for a long time. It was 2.2 in 2016 with GFR 26, which falls into the stage 4 category of chronic renal failure. Urine examination had pus cells, and USG abdomen and pelvis showed both kidneys had Staghorn calculus with mild hydroureteronephrosis. So after all this, when she came back for the next visit, her vision had decreased further to finger counting close to face in the right eye and 5/60 in the left eye. She had developed NVI in both eyes along with NVA. However, IOP was still normal. We started her on anti-glaucoma medications, and PRP was ordered in 4 sittings looking at her deranged renal status. So this is a picture after post PRP, and we could little slight macular edema had developed in the left eye, and post PRP, the NVD is still persisting as because we had taken the pictures immediately post PRP, so the NVD was not yet regressed. So from this we came to a diagnosis of calcification of retinal vessels due to secondary hyperparathyroidism in a case of chronic renal failure. So when we thought about the pathogenesis, we found out that in chronic renal failure, the mass of kidneys decreases, which leads to decreased excretion of phosphorus. As a result, serum phosphorus increases. Just a minute. So as a result, serum phosphorus level increases, and serum phosphorus has a tendency to bind with serum calcium, a very high affinity to serum calcium, which binds together to form calcium hydroxyapatite crystals. These crystals get deposited in the vessels, in the blood vessels. And when this phosphorus and calcium bind together to form this calcium hydroxyapatite crystals, generally they get deposited in the small arterioles of skin and subcutaneous tissue, which is known as a term called calciphylaxis, which is commonly found in skin and subcutaneous tissue, which can lead to gangrene. But this is never found in the eye before. However, when we saw this serum phosphorus binds to serum calcium, this serum calcium level decreases, which leads to an raise in the parathermal level, which was found in our case. The serum parathermal was very highly raised. Another thing is vitamin D2 is transferred into active vitamin D3 via renal 1-alpha hydroxylase, which is produced by the kidneys. In case of chronic renal failure, this renal 1-alpha hydroxylase is not produced. As a result, activated vitamin D3 is not produced. Now, activated activated vitamin D3 absorbs calcium from the gut to increase the serum calcium levels. When activated vitamin D3 is less, as a result, serum calcium again becomes less, which leads to increased parathermal levels. So this becomes a vicious cycle, leading to further production of this calcium hydroxyapatite crystals and more increased parathermal levels. Block et al. Recommended that when serum phosphorus levels are more than 5 and calcium phosphorus product is more than 55, it can lead to this vascular calcification in case of chronic renal failure. In our case, serum phosphorus was more than 5 and calcium phosphorus product was also more than 55. So when we looked into the posterior segment, when we studied the literature, we found out that what are the posterior segment manifestations of CKD reported. They are reported microvascular retinopathy like retinal hemorrhages, soft exudates due to retinal ischemia. There can be brucines and geographic atrophy. Now, coming to lipemia retinalis.
Anirban, I would like you to pause here. We'll come back to the posterior segment manifestations and the differentials. Okay, maybe you can skip that part. I'll ask you to present it again, so we have order to present. Yeah, you have furthermost lines.
No, just this. After this, only the treatment profile and one another case study which we had found similar from a literature.
Yeah, so we'll get back to you when we discuss the differentials. You can keep your presentation here itself.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you, Anirban, for presenting a very interesting and a very rare case. We do not see all these things quite often in the clinics, and definitely worthy of a publication. And I'm sure you guys are working towards it. So coming to Dr. Divyansh, and also sorry for refreshing our knowledge on physiology and biochemistry of calcium and phosphorus. So Dr. Divyansh, I'm going to ask a little out of the box question here. Okay, so how does one approach on a patient with an atypical fundus picture like what Anirban showed us? And suppose a patient walks in a clinic. So how do you approach such a case?
So congratulations to the presenter here. They were able to manage to get a diagnosis to it. So such kind of presentation, usually I would ask my best friend Google that how I should be helped if I see such kind of cases in an OPD, because we have to see the patient and then there are patients waiting outside and then simultaneously you need to think about the rare findings. So very difficult, yes, but I would like to think in two perspectives. One, what is common, what is uncommon, and what is rare. So seeing this common, I'm not sure what would fit in this. Usually arterial or venous occlusion, hypertensive retinopathy, diabetic retinopathy. In certain cases, we may have sclerosis. Post-surgery, yes, some kind of occlusions and this kind of sclerosis can be there. Some kind of inflammatory diseases which can be there, like retinal vasculitis, but in those cases we may have little infiltrates around them. So other uncommon things are lipemia retinalis, yes, but they have done the serum cortisol serum lipid profile, yeah. So in that is more so normal, but in lipemia retinalis that is completely deranged. Oxalosis is one more rare finding. And intravascular calcification as what they have suggested. I'm not sure because the literature doesn't give much answer about what to think of in such cases. One very rare finding which I could see while searching the literature was leukemia can also present with having this complete sheathing of blood vessels as what we can see. So, because for me to understand a case which has two findings which doesn't go hand in hand. One, that if the arteries are filled up with calcification, then why this kind of very severe ischemia which is coming up? Because as what has been mentioned, that in lipemia, even if the whole blood vessel is filled with that lipemic infiltrates, as in as you do an FFA, that shows that it is actually perfused. I'm not sure in this case because the FFA was not done considering the kidney status of the patient, but really both the things it's difficult to understand that why they are developing such severe proliferation, not responding, going on to having neovascularization, and so not sure. So it's difficult for me.
No, but one thing I liked from the point even for our participants to understand that we can always classify such rare phenomena as whether it's typical or atypical, like what you said, common, uncommon, or rare. So if it's typical, okay, we can go to the books and find out. If it's atypical, we have to think little beyond from what we routinely do. So coming to, if you can, Anirban, go to your OCT picture, the fundus photograph of the OCT picture. There's one interesting finding there. So, Apurva, since you pointed out that finding in the chat earlier, so what is your comment on the outer retinal deposits, those drusen-like deposits in the macula, which are outlined better on the OCT? So, your comments on that and what do you think they are? Yeah, you can stay there, Anirban, on the fundus photograph and the OCT. Yeah,
OCT.
OCT. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are multiple great findings on the OCT. Can I share some? Can I share the screen and use the pointer maybe?
I stop sharing, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay.
Apurva, probably because you need to, if you have the presentation which he's presenting, you can open and then, yeah.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'll just describe it. Please share the OCT again. So in the right eye, we can see that there is some acute ischemia going on in the nasal macula, because we can see this inner hyperreflective layers, and there is a prominent middle limiting membrane which is called a PMLM. I think there is a small vein occlusion there, because this PMLM is pretty common in vein occlusions. So some acute ischemia is going on there, some PAM sort of lesion is there, and also these drusen. If you look at the right eye, the macular thickness is pretty good, and there is this kind of irregular PED or drusenoid sort of elevation of the RPE. Now, if you look at the left eye, the macula is much thinner, and the foveal contour is there, but the macula, especially the temporal macula, is much thinner. And you can see there are these round lesions at the level of the RP and the Brooks membrane. This has a hyperreflective wall and a hyporeflective halo. One differential for this kind of finding that comes to mind is those feeder vessels that we see in fibrovascular PED. So I suspect that this patient has so much ischemia, global ischemia, if I may say so, that there are the capillaries in the intraretinal layers are getting occluded, causing this sort of PMLM. The outer retina is also ischemic, so it is probably causing some neovascularization, which is yet to happen probably in the right eye and has already happened in the left eye. If you see the choroid also, it's very thin in the left eye. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find that this is a regressed neovascular membrane, but there's no way of finding out. So, all this is like, I should admit that these are flights of thoughts that I've had, but that's the closest I can come to, because this finding is really peculiar. I did not find any literature on this finding. The only thing that comes to mind is the feeder vessels, and I'm talking about the left eye, those round structures between the RP and the Brooks. So it will be very interesting to see the OCT of the macula, which probably Anirban has not shown. It will be nice to see if there is any dead tree appearance or something on the left eye octa of the macula. I know you have shown the disc octa.
Yeah, ma'am. But actually, when we searched for, we actually looked at the macular octa pictures, but we could not find any neovascular structures sub-RP at the sub-RP level.
Actually, your segmentation is a big problem in such macular thinning, so we'll have to manually segment it and see.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so Dr. Chittaranjan is saying octa. Okay, the patient could not focus. That's why the octa was not possible. Okay. Yeah. So excellent points. Like the way you dissect such small OCTs and find out such beautiful points is commendable. So moving on to the other aspect of this case, that is a neovascularization, or why the ischemia happened here. So I would like to bring in Dr. Mohit here. So Dr. Mohit, what came the cause of neovascularization in this case?
Absolutely. So again, I wasted a lot of time in the last case. I'm going to try and be precise with this one. So I don't think this case is what it's actually meant out to be. I think this is a case of, CRF-induced hyperoxaluria and actually oxalate deposition. I have one slide, not one slide, but actually Dr. Anirban actually wanted to show a case which he did not quite follow through. It's actually in one of his slides. If he can just stop sharing, I just want to show one thing. And all the questions as to what those lesions are, I think that it should be answered with that. Thank you. Yeah, so is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see it, yeah.
Okay, so this is a 1989. So unfortunately, pre-OCT era, but the pre-OCT era was great because you had histopathology, actual. So let's see whether it can kind of answer what we have or not, right? So this patient was 55, similar to what he had, renal failure, was hemodialysis. We're not getting into details. This does not look like does not look exactly like what Anirban had, right? That does. That is the histopathology of that eye, of course, later on.
It's gross.
It's gross, but you can see what's happening. That explains. Now, as far as now coming to the new vascularization, and thirdly, coming to what's happening in the macula. As far as new vascularization is concerned, that's what this patient had. And there are 2 other case reports with histopathology and angiography in these patients, which again, I'm not going to be showing, but because this kind of case kind of sums it up. And each of them have this degree of ischemia. As far as what's happening in the macula, you have histopathology there. And although this is not that great, the other one, I can share the link in the chat group. So those things which are there, which are some of those are hypo with a hyper wall, some are hyper, and all of those are actually oxalate crystals. And the other case report, which actually is, I have it open with me, which is actually that one. So that is what it is. That is the crystal. That is the RPE. So it can be between the Bruch's RPE, above the RPE, between the RPE and the neurosensory retina, and all the way through. So yeah, that's that, and that's what you get.
If you can go to the angio, just scroll the slide down.
Yeah.
Is it the actual attenuation of the arteries here leading to the ischemia?
No.
Okay.
No. So this is a milder case. So Caucasian. So if you were to look at the gaseous atlas.
Yeah.
So in Caucasians, in lightly pigmented irises, chronic oxalosis actually presents with this black macular scar because those oxalate crystals in the macula actually oxidize.
Okay.
In non-Caucasians, I don't know. I don't have I couldn't get any. In pigmented people, I couldn't get any literature. But you can have a spectrum which can be just like that, or you could have the other one. And that lady, mind you, that gross picture was at 55 years of age. So she died because of gastrointestinal bleeding. It's not like she got the disease at 55 and we got the eyes at 80. So it's fairly similar. So I think it explains the clinical appearance looks a lot like it, explains the histopathology, explains the OCT picture, and the angiogram explains the neovascularization. To my mind, I think looks like that. But again,
yes, sir. So just one point, sir. But that case you showed, that patient had that patient had on renal examination had oxalate crystals in urine. But our patient did not have any oxalate crystals in urine where there was abundant phosphate crystals. That was the contradiction that we had. That is why we could not think it of as oxalosis, of oxaluria. That was the,
So this patient didn't. So you have primary oxaluria, hyperoxaluria. This is a 7-year-old kid. You have the other one, so you can have acquired, which is chronic renal failure induced. So chronic renal, that patient that you're talking about had a renal transplant, had a chronic renal failure, and was on hemodialysis. Hemodialysis patients with chronic renal failure will have more oxaluria, but you can still have that without that. You still have oxalate all over the body without excreting a lot of it in the urine.
Okay.
However, if you are on hemodialysis, that's not going to happen. You're also going to excrete a lot in the urine because your urinary excretion is getting better with hemodialysis.
Yeah, excellent points, Dr. Mohit. So if we can go back to Anirban's presentation, and other important aspect here would be to discuss about the differentials. So a few of the differential Dr. Divyansh already mentioned, and Anirban, if you can share your slides and go to the differentials.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so Dr. Divyansh, you want to take this forward about what will be the differential diagnosis and how you can differentiate them?
Let him present because he has the comparison. Yeah.
Correct. Anirban, go ahead, Anirban. After that, we can have the,
So these were my differentials, which I
You can take your time. You can present Anirban, no problem.
okay. So we thought of lipemia retinalis, which was ruled out from the lipid profile. PDR and RVO was ruled out because sugars and blood pressure were normal, and that we had a confusion with because of that oxalosis, because we did not have oxalate in urine, but Mohit sir told that it can present without excreting oxalate crystals in urine. That can be a DD. That can be a provisional diagnosis. And then this I think we have covered.
So maybe Dr. Mohit
So-
can write a letter to the editor now.
Yeah.
So
No.
this was the picture sir was showing. This was
Yeah.
case was reported in 1989, and this was the differentials. That our case was 58 years. That case was 55 years, and it was a duration of CR was of 16 years with dialysis for 5 years. That patient had, and presented with oxalate crystals in urine. And when we searched the literature, we've only found another case like this of chronic renal failure reported by Patel et al. in British Journal of Ophthalmology in 2002, which reported a similar kind of finding of retinal arteriolar calcification in a case of chronic renal failure, but their case was of only 33 years old female with a duration of CRF for 18 years and a duration of dialysis for 10 years. However, our case was only 4 years of chronic renal failure with no dialysis. And treatment, we actually sent it to the nephrologist for the treatment. It was not in our hand to treat the cause. It may need a dialysis or kidney transplant, and rest of the things were managed by the nephrologist itself. From our side, we did a PRP, but even after doing a PRP, the vision had decreased further. So my questions to the panelists were, any similar case reports, how to manage the case, and whether to do PRP in such a case or not.
Yeah, Dr. Divyansh, you'd like to come in?
So the very rare case, very difficult. So as Mohit also showed that the case of oxalosis, because I think they may have already like in their discussion would have mentioned this, because that's the most closest differential which can be there, and that also landed up into neovascularization. And the case reports which are there for this oxalate crystal deposits, the problem is that that case did not develop neovascularization. So I think Mohit has a very probably the better guess out of the two. So, but still, I think the neovascularization would still persist or progress is what I feel in this case. Hopefully, the authors would be able to tell us what the future would be for this. But really interesting case.
Yeah.
Lot to learn about it.
So yes, so once again, a little bit out of the box question to Apurva. How different would you have approached this case?
Wow. Okay. So first of all, I would have been bamboozled by this case. I think it would have taken me some time to recover from what I saw. And congrats to Anirban and all his mentors at Arvind for doing such a
And
great
I also
job.
would like to mention Dr. Chittaranjan Mishra. He helped me a lot with this case.
Yeah, so I would not like to say what I would have done differently. I would just like to point out and kind of reiterate and like keep telling ourselves that there is no end to the mysteries of human disease. And I think we should keep reading and updating ourselves, and we should not stop to the best of our ability, try to go to the end of whatever we see and kind of try to find out no matter what. So I would suggest that, I mean, I'm sure all of us are, whoever attends late night retina obviously wants to learn a lot. So I think let's all like promise ourselves to kind of keep updating ourselves and never stop reading and give the best possible patient care.
Yeah,
That's all I have to say.
correct. Yeah. So I think speaking of late night retina is actually going quite later into the night now. So just to summarize quickly,
One last
this.
point, please, Bhavik, if it's
Yeah,
not,
yeah, yes,
not
Dr. Mohit.
really getting into anybody. Just this is a little bit off the topic, but this is just so oxalosis or not. I'm not getting into that. I think what I saw, and that's why I presented, fitted the bill and ticked most boxes as to what this patient had. But I think two other things which are a little more commoner in chronic renal failure patients, I think need to be. I think one needs to be aware, And I would like to thank Divyansh in this, because a couple of years back is at one of the RetNets is actually when Dr. Michael Stewart presented one case. So there is something that so chronic renal failure can cause secondary hyperparathyroidism. It can also cause something which is known as tertiary hyperparathyroidism. So with secondary hyperparathyroidism, basically you get calcium deposits all over. Calcium hydroxyapatite, I think, if I'm not wrong, Anirban.
Right.
So what you would get is the non-idiopathic variety of sclerochoroidal calcification with that. I think Apurva briefly touched upon that yesterday. So, that's something that needs to be looked at. You also have your syndromes like Gittelman and Barters and, all of that. So that's something that can be a presentation of renal failure, maybe not chronic, maybe a patient going into chronic, but that's happening. The second and the last point, which is rare, the only time I had seen it a couple of years back at RetNet, as I said, Dr. Michael Stewart presented, chronic renal failure patient on hemodialysis, developed tertiary hyperparathyroidism, developed huge exudative retinal detachments. They thought it's UV diffusion syndrome. Everything was fine. That I think gentleman was 60. They actually went down and they couldn't get the fluid out they couldn't give too many steroids, diabetic hypertensive, lots of things. Finally, they resorted to making a scleral window. When they actually got down to making the scleral window, if you've done your type 1 UV diffusion in which the sclera is that thick, believe me, and again, Dr. Michael Stewart showed it. Not only was the sclera, normally it's this, in type 1 UV diffusion, it's that. In tertiary hyperparathyroidism, it was that. And he wasted 4 15-degree keratomes, broke them while trying to cut them because he was cutting through calcified chalk-like sclera. So that's something you can get. And that's the acquired uveal effusion syndrome, which is your tertiary hyperparathyroidism. Only predisposing factor for that patient was chronic renal failure. They had to do it both sides. It was very difficult. However, after doing that, they could get the fluid off of the macula and very little remained inferiorly. So I think those two things are also something which we might see down the line. Just because chronic renal failures tend to survive a lot longer with us now, I think we might be seeing what the Westerners actually started seeing 10 years prior to now. So just wanted to share that.
It will be interesting to see if Paget's disease or osteopetrosis will have such findings as well. We can find out maybe.
Yeah. So another food for thought from Dr. Apurva to all our viewers and participants. So before we just end now, just to some.
1 minute.
Yeah, Dr. Abhishek.
Sorry, just one small comment. One case I had seen, patient presented with posterior lenticonus, and he had peripheral retinal flex, and he was very drowsy. So I, just to capture the peripheral retinal flex, I did a fundus photograph, and he was so drowsy that he was not sitting over the stool, and he kept falling back. So I thought that he was uncooperative and scolded him for that. But again and again he was repeating. So just because of posterior lenticonus, I thought that some renal failure issues might be there, and I ordered a blood urea and serum creat, and they were like, blood urea was 10 times elevated and serum creat was 5 times elevated. So a posterior lenticonus sign with some retinal flex should also lead us to think about chronic renal failure, and patient was unaware of that he had renal issues.
Yeah, so that is what I was coming to. Any young individual or any individual with retinal vessel abnormality or any retinal pathology, so whenever you see associated attenuation of the arterioles, just make sure you check the blood pressure first for that patient, and also investigate for a renal profile of that individual.
Bhavik, just want to add that they may have severe headaches, and they would have visited hundreds of physicians for that. And then you would see all this kinds of something which is called as nephropathy associated retinopathy. So where you would see PEDs, which would be there, like not like CSRs, but very large PEDs, and those would be having superficial hemorrhages, dot plot hemorrhages along with this. So it would be kind of a mixed picture. And headache is one of the things which they may also present with.
And even occasionally they can have a picture like a retinitis pigmentosa, that the vessels have they do not have night blindness per se history, but they present with such a fundus picture that it may mimic retinitis pigmentosa as well. That is what I was coming to.
And frosted branchitis.
Exactly, yeah.
Picture can actually be a presenting sign of accelerated hypertension, MPGN, related. That's also something. Anything atypical, absolutely, as you said.
Yeah. So even the cuticular drusen can lead to MPGN and all of this. So any abnormal retinal finding which you find in the normal individual, look out for a cause and think beyond the eye. That will help us save the life of an individual. So with this, we had wonderful discussion, and I would like to thank the entire panelists, Dr. Divyansh, Dr. Mohit, Dr. Apurva, and the two presenters, Dr. Abhishek and Dr. Anirban. So thank you all, and we'll meet again soon for our episode number 14. Okay, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.